everybody, and thank you so much for joining what is the first CTPSR Webinar series event for the academic year. And to kick off this event, it's a pleasure to host Professor Simon Dalby, who will be speaking on what I think is an extremely relevant topic for this time, but also particularly in the lead up to COP26. So I'll hand over to the chair of this session now, Dr. Jess Northey.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a huge pleasure to welcome all of you, our colleagues here at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and most importantly, our guest, Professor Simon Dalby. Professor Dalby is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. His most recent publications and extensive publications on the topic that we're going to be discussing today include books on climate change and environmental security and geopolitics. He is the author of The Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security and Sustainability with Ottawa Press in 2020, and Security and Environmental Change, published with Polity in 2019. And he also wrote Reframing Climate Change, Constructing Ecological Geopolitics, published with Routledge in 2016. Professor Dalby has studied at Trinity College Dublin, the University of Victoria, and he has a PhD from Simon Fraser University. And he previously worked as a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada. Simon, it's really a huge privilege for us to welcome you to the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, virtually for the moment. Thank you once again for accepting this invitation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. My title is quite simply Pandemic Geopolitics in the Anthropocene. There's three very big words in there, and I want to start briefly with the one in the middle, geopolitics, because much of what I have done has been about geopolitics. But it's time, it seems to me, not just because of climate change, to reconsider what we mean by geopolitics and to link it up with some of the other themes that are going around, not least climate change these days. So it seems to me that we are living in a very interesting period. The title geopolitics refers to what many geographers have been writing about, the links between geography and politics. This is a very fuzzy image. For those of you who remember the Berlin Wall, it's fairly obvious, but it's getting to be a little hazy in most of our memories. Geopolitics is about, obviously, borders. It's about walls, but it's also about a rapidly changing world. He writes, the world is actively spatialized, divided up, labeled, sorted out into a hierarchy of places of greater or lesser importance by political geographers, other academics, and political leaders. This process provides the geographical framing within which political elites and mass publics act in the world in pursuit of their own identities and interests. The emphasis here is on the geographical framing. In other words, the basic categories of here and there, inside and outside, that structure political discourse are frequently so obvious we don't actually stop and think about how it is that we actually look at the world. How do we see the world? What are the categories, basic forms of geographical knowledge which structure political thinking? Much of the last few decades of critical geopolitics work in the geography discipline has been precisely about trying to unpack the taken for granted assumptions built into the categories that are used for framing how politicians understand the world. Maybe I should say rude things about Brexit here, but clearly there's implicit geographies in how it is that the world is understood by politicians and by publics. And that has been a key part of geopolitics. So geopolitics is in part about how we see the world, how we view the world, how we understand our place in it. And that, of course, has been what spaces, places, and politics have been about. But in the last few years, it's also become clear that that whole context and our geographical framing of how we understand the world has been fundamentally altered, even if we've been slow to note that the sheer scale of human activities is now generating all sorts of new phenomena. The framing, to use Agnew's terms, needs an update, and it needs an update because we really now can see human fingerprints all over things like climate change, extinction crises, global pollution events, and so on. The term Anthropocene is precisely the term that is now increasingly used across the disciplines to specify these new circumstances. And this Lewis and Maslin book from a few years ago is particularly good, not least because it has that really very, very clever subtitle, How We Created the Anthropocene. The book talks about both the physical, the biophysical transformation of the Earth system that is currently ongoing, but also about how it is that the knowledge practices that generated this term Anthropocene understand how we in turn understand those new circumstances that we are making. And it was my attempt to put those things together that generated the term Anthropocene Geopolitics. And this is my book from last year, emphasizing the extraordinary scale of human activities and how landscapes have been transformed, both directly physically, but also by the waste products that come from oil wells in particular. And yes, that is a little bit of Canadian content for Canadians watching. Ted Bertinsky's extraordinary photographs. I was lucky enough to get a freebie from him to put on the cover of my recent book. Oil wells are clearly important. Clearly, fossil fuels are part of the absolutely essential engagement with climate change. But it's worth bearing in mind that this oil field, why do we call them fields, by the way? This oil field is actually California, not Saudi Arabia, as one might expect, because of course the legacy of the whole petroculture that is modernity is heavily related to American exploitation of fossil fuels first. And that legacy, of course, is crucial to much of the discussion of climate change and who should do what about it. But in the last little while, worrying about climate, worrying about sustainability and globalization and their interconnections has become a whole lot more complicated by that third word in my title, because the pandemic has changed how we think about a whole lot of these things. And what information we have about the world, how that gets transferred, is also part and parcel now about geopolitics, because the spatial framing, whence the virus comes, how it is dangerous, what we should do about it, is of course part and parcel nowadays about how we think about the world. The spatial framing that we use to tackle these new ecological hazards is something that we need to reflect upon, because it's very obvious that traditional notions of armed borders, guns, boundaries, territorial sovereignty, etc., really are not a series of categories that are helpful when we have to deal with viruses which have caused so much chaos in the last couple of years for all of us and have killed close to 5 million people around the world since they first emerged just about 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago. So we are facing an unhealthy geopolitics in addition to a climate geopolitics, and how we understand the geographical categories brought to bear on all this. I've added another twist to the Anthropocene that we also need to factor in, and we need to think carefully about how it is that we organize our societies to tackle these issues. One might expect that the Americans, with supposedly one of the finest high-tech medical systems going, along with the National Health Service in Britain and the very strange system that we live with, run by provinces here in Canada, ought to be ready for dealing with these kinds of things. Clearly, public health is something that modern societies have been doing for a long time. But if one actually digs into what has happened over the last 2 years, one of the things that is alarmingly clear, particularly here in the case of the American story, is that there wasn't really an effective public health system. The book PREMONITION tells the stories mostly of California and some of the key people who knew that they had a major crisis on their hands early on in the pandemic and were unable to get the attention of authorities, unable to deal properly with it. And the lack of proper preparation, of course, has been one of the things that has been harshly revealed over the last 2 years. We simply should have had a public health system ready to go, because as anybody who read Laurie Garrett's book from 25 years ago knew, there were pandemics coming. We didn't know exactly which virus, and we didn't know exactly when it was going to come. But clearly the ecological disruptions of the world back even in the 1990s made it very clear that plagues were coming, and that we needed to be prepared to deal with them. And good, robust public health systems are absolutely crucial for dealing with infectious diseases. And well, an awful lot of people were asleep at the wheel, it seems. Clearly, diseases were not considered, at least in the West. The North, should that be, as something that needed to be engaged. One could make the argument that Zika, SARS, MERS, Ebola had all been successfully contained. And therefore, they weren't an issue for, you know, the modern states that have public health and doctors and hospitals ready to go. But that sadly has turned out to be not the case. Because quite clearly, we live in a world in which the distinctions between the North and the South, between the developed and the undeveloped, simply don't apply in a world where interconnections, cities, roads, railways, transmission lines, pipelines, shipping lanes, submarine cables, flight routes, all of these things are the increasingly artificial world that we live in. They are increasingly the world of connectivity. They are the world in which viruses and everything else travel through all sorts of trade routes and all sorts of communication systems, which don't fit our traditional understanding of how governance should work, and particularly don't fit the spatial framing of the world that school atlases suggest, and for that matter, politicians focused on national sovereignty think ought to be the ordering of the world in which decisions are made and human life is conducted. Decisions are enforced, rules are made, and rulings are made by rulers. This is the sovereign state world. But the contrast between the globalized world in the previous image and this rather interesting Italian version of the world map, only partly translated, which is why I find it rather humorous, is clearly the disjuncture that contemporary geopolitics is dealing with, highlighted by the scramble to close borders and try to use old territorial strategies to deal explicitly with the phenomena of globalization. We are reminded about that all again in the last week or so, where once again questions of who takes money from which jurisdiction and lands it in which other jurisdiction to hide it from the taxman or the taxwoman or the revenue authorities, whatever is the appropriate term in your jurisdiction, is highlighting the inequities in our global system, but also the fact that we live in a world of globalization where money can hide and all sorts of strange things have emerged in the last week. A former Prime Minister of Britain has been in the headlines too because of a real estate transaction that was conducted offshore and so on. But the contrast between this world in which money can hide, and this is obviously referring to the Panama Papers, which were the previous expose of how this worked, and contrasting it with where people can move, where money can move easily and people can't in the reverse direction, of course, is absolutely crucial to understanding the human consequences of globalization. And we need to understand these interconnections in a geography that's much more sophisticated than the one that the simple atlas of where it is that state boundaries are suggests. So the spatial framing, to use Agnew's terms, that we need is much more complicated. And the virus, of course, has highlighted this. But it is also, of course, being very dramatically changed or challenged by climate change, because one of the crucial things that we are all now dealing with is the recognition that climates of the past are no longer a reliable indication of what's coming in the future. The contrast is perhaps most sharply clear in these two quotes. Greta Thunberg, who needs no introduction to most people these days, was at the United Nations in September of 2019. People are dying, she told everyone. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? Because, of course, what was on Greta Thunberg's mind was the planetary boundaries of Earth system science. Born this century, those are the boundaries that are crucially important. But if you were born in the last century, as a certain Donald Trump, remember him, was, then his argument was it's all about being a patriot. It's about being a good citizen of a particular state. The future does not belong to globalists, he insisted. And of course, his argument the future belongs to the patriots was all about closing borders, imposing trade restrictions on China and other places, calling the virus Kung Flu, the Chinese virus, was of course all about reimposing a geographical framing that was about patriotism. What happened in other states was simply irrelevant. It was all about what you did for your state, Donald told us. And the contrast here is the one I want to draw out for the rest of the talk, because it's precisely what boundaries matter most, what rules might matter if one took the planetary boundaries seriously, or dramatically different from those than if one takes state boundaries as the most important ones. If my mother's calculations had been correct, I would have appeared more or less exactly as the first data point on this graph actually appeared. Yes, you've all seen the Mauna Loa plot of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but stop and think about it. Look at that diagram again. What was the concentration of parts per million by volume, to be technical, of carbon dioxide on the planet when you were born? Some people are actually using the ppmv number on their Twitter feeds and things to identify when they appeared in planetary system. And it's worth stopping and thinking, because clearly this is changing dramatically. It was fairly stable up until the 19th century, began a very gradual increase and now is accelerating. And it's precisely this concern about the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which is of course one of the crucial planetary boundaries that so worries Greta Thunberg. Can we build a world in which, as Kate Rowath suggests, we think seriously about donut economics? Can we stop overshooting our planetary boundaries ecologically, but yet build a social foundation underneath, as it were, or inside, to use the donut formulation in that famous diagram? Becomes the really big question. Can those state boundaries actually be useful for how we think through this in a globalized world? This is, of course, now the really big question. Can we do peace and justice? Can we do housing? Can we do some effort at gender equality, providing health? Remember that virus? Can we do this within the planetary boundaries ecologically? Because clearly at least one of them has been transcended, and that is climate change. Can we do sensible living? Can we do agricultural production? Can we make things without burning stuff on the scale that is necessary to live within the donut? The difficulty here is that Trump in particular was adamant that walls were essential, and there's been a meme in the last little while about milk crates superimposed on walls to suggest that ladders are much cheaper than walls. Walls can be transcended using a very simple technology of a ladder in ways that people who build walls frequently seem to forget. This is a particularly odd image because obviously it'd be much easier to simply sneak down and jump over that wall further down behind the milk crates. But the point about this is that we're living in an increasingly artificial world in which practical technologies, like in this case, boxes, the milk crates that are being superimposed on images of walls here, allow us to think about boundaries as merely temporary. The old-fashioned geographical distinctions enforced with fences can be transcended by all sorts of relatively cheap and easy technologies. This is the contradiction that we face now. A world in which the geographical imagination of states is being transcended sometimes by very simple technologies. The attempt to stop progress and the migrations of numerous species, also questions of wildlife, questions of which animals humans decide will inhabit the world. But we now need to join up the consequences of climate change, and which doesn't respect any boundaries, with the necessity of trying to protect people from viruses and diseases too. And this is the image from Australia last year, where one is dealing with wildfire threatening old folks who are, of course, also threatened by the viruses. And so our various measures to deal with one hazard have to be made at least loosely consistent with our attempts to deal with secondary hazards or second or third hazards. And here, of course, evacuating old folks in the face of fire while trying to not facilitate was a real issue that has concentrated the minds of many people on the ecological interconnections between viruses, climate change, and wildfire, which of course is rising rapidly in many parts of the world as an additional hazard. It's that combination of dangers that we really do now need to think our way through in terms of how it is that the planet is being affected by climate change. One of the headlines that emphasizes the importance of this came more or less the same time as some of the wildfires in both Australia and the United States. And this was the tropical storm Amphan that went up the Bay of Bengal, heading towards Bangladesh and Kolkata. The point about this one was that the climate scientists were pointing out that because of the measures to deal with the virus, which included the rapid shutdown of a substantial part of the Indian economy, air pollution had been dramatically reduced. Well, that's a good thing, one would think, wouldn't one? But because of less air pollution, lots more sunshine was actually getting through to warm the waters in the Bay of Bengal, actually feeding the energy in the tropical storm, and hence making the damage that it did when it hit Bangladesh and India worse. So there's a huge irony here, where the shutdown of the economy, reducing pollution, actually, so the argument was, made the storms worse. And it's the interconnection between these kinds of things is the crucial point about why we use this term, the Anthropocene, because clearly human activities are changing ecological systems in all sorts of ways that are novel, that we haven't really integrated into how we think about peace, change, conflict, and disruption. And this is just one example of how it is that this new world, this new increasingly artificial world of the Anthropocene, has to be worked into our thinking if we're going to grapple with the world as we transform it. And then came headlines from the other side of the world, even more bizarre connections between the virus and ecology. Yes, this is a mink in a cage in Denmark, because one of the things that we ended up confronting was the possibility that the virus would, the COVID virus would jump from humans to animals, mutate in animals, and then jump back in mutated form back into the human population. Great concern that the mink farms in the north end of Denmark, did you know there were millions and millions of mink being bred for the international market in the north end of Denmark? Well, we discovered all this last year when millions of these mink were slaughtered and buried in an attempt to prevent the virus, which had jumped from humans to mink, jumping back in mutated forms to humans to spread yet another variant, which would cause further difficulties for the human population. Because, of course, what is often forgotten in this discussion of the Anthropocene is that one of the consequences of human activities, and farming in particular, is to dramatically change the species, the terrestrial species mix on the planet. Now the vast majority of animals are pets and are farm animals, both for food and used, at least in a few places still, as locomotive forces for pulling plows and so on. But the vast majority of the animal biomass on at least the Earth's surface, not in the oceans, but on the Earth and on the terrestrial species, are either humans or are farm animals. It's a dramatically changed world in which wild animals are those little green squares scattered around here. But the vast majority of the animal population now is either us or animals that we've domesticated and used to spread across the landscapes for food. So we are living in an ecological mix now that is dramatically different from historically what humanity knew through most of its history. And of course, there's no actual mink on this particular graphic, but it does suggest that farm animals are absolutely crucial. They also relate, of course, to diseases and to pandemics. Smallpox and other historical zoonotic diseases that have plagued humanity have often come from our farm animals. And we need to stop and think not just about pangolins, bats, and the possibility of virus transmission in the wet markets of Wuhan, but we also need to think about the larger ecology of these artificial systems, the other side of what everybody is worried about now with the massive extinction rates, because frankly, the ecosystems of the planet are being squeezed out to spread the farm animals around and to spread the plantations for all sorts of commodities that feed, yes, and supply fuel and food and fodder and everything else for our global system. And we need to stop and think about that too, because the consequences are dramatically expanding rates of extinction for those wild animals squeezed into ever more marginal ecosystems. And of course, in some cases then, because of that marginalization of migration, species, viruses, species jumping to humans in not only China, but Africa, South Asia, and other places too. And that's, again, and of course, that is at least part of what is driving the extinction rate, which is why the intergovernmental folks worrying about ecosystem services and biodiversity are jumping up and down, yelling at least as loudly as the climate change folks, although they're not getting as much attention these days. We can also see the consequences of our extraordinary use of fossil fuels in the emerging new sedimentary layers that are appearing on some beaches, the so-called plastiglomerates, in which plastic waste is increasingly getting mixed in with sediments, generating a whole new class of rocks effectively, although they haven't consolidated into permanent sediments, which we would call rocks yet. Clearly they are going to. And this too adds another fundamental change to the ecosystems of the planet, which will show up in the future geological sediments of the planet. Hence that Anthropocene designation works here too, in terms of that new phenomena that will appear in the future geology of the planet. In short, to use the old Pogo syndrome problem from Walt Kelly's cartoons of a very long time ago, we have met the enemy and he is us. One of his collections of cartoons was called Impollutable Pogo, and indeed one of Pogo's buddies used precisely this name, or this theme of we have met the enemy and he is us. In other words, humans' actions are generating all sorts of climatological and extinction risks for the future of humanity, and it's us that is doing it to us. Hence, he is us. This is something that is absolutely crucial now to understanding the future geology of the planet. And it's one thing that is raising all sorts of concerns about the failure of political elites to tackle these problems effectively. And it seems that Greta Thunberg got a new friend in the last week, Her Majesty expressing her irritation at the failure of political leaders to grapple effectively with the climate problem. And so I think we need to stop and reflect about who's doing what to whom much more effectively than we have done until very recently. It's perfectly obvious to the Greta Thunbergs of this world. It seems to be perfectly obvious to Her Majesty too, that it's time to get serious about these issues and think seriously about what kind of a planet we are quite literally building. Up the road, some of your colleagues in Newcastle have been pondering this issue too, focusing explicitly on how it is that the consumption in our urban system, and particularly the big cities of the world, is driving the disruptions at a distance. The commodity change that stretch across the planet, and which we've all begun to understand have been dramatically disrupted over the last couple of years because of the pandemic and the attempts to respond to the pandemic, need to be focused on much more explicitly. Concrete is a major problem in terms of climate change, and literally how we build future cities. And in the case of this book, particularly focusing on China and its urban plans. Of course, it's crucial to consider the future, because what kind of infrastructure, what kind of buildings, using what kind of materials, powered by what kind of energy is absolutely crucial to shaping the future of the Anthropocene, because we are literally remaking the Earth system and doing so dramatically and quickly. And that has to be the focus if we are to prevent ourselves moving into increasingly disrupted world in which the hothouse trajectory, where everything overheats and these major ecological systems get increasingly disrupted and interact with each other to accelerate the disruption. That is what we need to avoid. The future of the Anthropocene, if we're all going to live reasonably well, has to be one that avoids these major disruptions. And that, of course, is why what will be discussed in Glasgow in the coming weeks at COP is absolutely crucial, because avoiding this hothouse trajectory with all of these major disruptions interconnecting with each other has to be the priority for policymakers, and frankly for scholars and citizens, and get the ear of the major investment houses and the major banks, because clearly investing in sustainable futures has to be a high priority for all of us. But we need to understand that in terms of traditional understandings of security, now national security, intelligence, thinking about the future, all of this has to be linked up because increasingly disasters which have to be prevented are increasingly artificial because of the disruptions of infrastructure, because of the bizarre connections like such things as shutting down the Indian economy to prevent the spread of the virus, leading to less pollution and hence warmer waters in the Bay of Bengal, making more severe storms. It's those kinds of interconnections that now have to be on the agenda of anyone who's seriously thinking about the future, because we're all increasingly vulnerable to the disruptions of our artificial world. And we're also increasingly vulnerable to the disruptions of cyberspace, bad behavior on the internet, sometimes deliberate, sometimes not, can connect with environmental difficulties too if power stations are taken offline, if internet systems that power our finances, if the ability to connect on Zoom is disrupted, then our world has all sorts of difficulties as well. And we have to understand ourselves living in an increasingly artificial world in which traditional notions of borders are increasingly unhelpful, which is why the most recent journal article that I published just talks about this as unsustainable borders, in which I'm trying to compare Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump's implicit assumptions about the world, that spatial framing that Agnew talks about as being the heart of geopolitics, now has to be complemented by an understanding of the ecological interconnections across those borders. But we also need to think in terms of planetary boundaries, not just borders understood as concrete and fences, but understood in terms of the ecological thresholds, which we should not cross if we wish to avoid getting ourselves into the runaway climate change trajectories of the hothouse world, which the Earth system scientists have been warning us we really should avoid. The pandemic has simply highlighted this, emphasizing the interconnectedness across borders, the commodity chains that have been disrupted as we've shut down the economy, attempted to grapple simultaneously with getting personal protective equipment, what we all learned was called PPE last year, across the borders, while making sure that the virus didn't cross the border, understanding that the boundaries between different species, whether it's pangolins or minks, and humans in terms of virus transmission, all of that has to be added in now to our understanding of geopolitics, because the spatial framing which politicians and scholars use to think about these has been fundamentally challenged by climate change, species extinction, and the proliferation of the COVID virus. That's the world in which we now need to think. And the pandemic has made us focus very, very explicitly on how it is that the spatial framing, those uses of borders in governance, has been done, and how in many cases, particularly in the pandemic, it has failed to grapple effectively with global change. And the same fear most of us have is that that series of bordering practices, the knowledge built into the taken for granted categories we have about the world, may also fail to grapple effectively with climate change in coming years too. Hence, my concern that the pandemic is something that needs to be worked into how we think about Anthropocene geopolitics by all of us, whatever discipline we happen to be operating in. So do stop and think about borders, do stop and think about how whatever discipline you're working in takes for granted the world and its spatial categories, and challenge those to think about policy and politics in more innovative ways, because we clearly all need to do so in this new artificial world of the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this absolutely engaging, challenging, and difficult presentation that you've delivered today. It's your work has been a huge inspiration, I know, for us and our colleagues who are working on environment, conflicts and sustainability within our master's program and in our research. What I think is the most impressive is the range of challenges that you tackle within your publications and also in the presentation today, making us question our assumptions. Well, politicians have to question their assumptions, as do IR scholars and all scholars and academics across the board, into what will happen in the future, and this assumption of continuationism, as you described, the idea that we're just going to continue as before and no longer be taken for granted. And the concept of stationarity is taken from hydrology, and our colleagues with us today are working in hydrology, the idea that you can predict within a flux within a certain range, but that no longer applies, and that we have to be thinking in very different ways about how our future world is going to look due to the changes and the impact that we've had through the Anthropocene. And I was very interested in your focus on the borders, on this aspect of borders and migration. We have a whole research group working on migration, and I'm working with a colleague, quite a well-known migration scholar, who recently tried to present a report to a funder with the title "Migration as the Solution to Climate Change." And this was rejected as a possible title, and this was very much not in the agenda of the funder, and this was not how they considered migration to be as a solution. And so then there was a whole discussion and debate as to how that would then be framed. But I understand from your research and the books and your publications that we will need to adapt, we will need to move, and people will need to move, and therefore migration will need to be facilitated and need to be considered in different ways. And you quoted in one of your articles, I think it's Michael Mann, on this issue of special treatment for refugees, and perhaps more than, I think the argument goes, looking at special treatment for refugees or for climate refugees, we need to consider the rights of all migrants in a context when we will have to consider significantly greater migration as a result of what's happening now. But I just wondered perhaps if you could just talk about that need. Do you agree with that? Do we need to consider climate refugees differently, or do we need to think more holistically about migration and all migrants in the coming years?
Just a couple of thoughts on that point. In some cases, clearly people are climate migrants and could not be understood as anything else. Simply because places that are getting flooded by rising sea levels, this is obviously caused by climate. They have to move if they're going to live, or else they're going to have to get very imaginative, like some of the folks in the Netherlands are, and literally build houses that float and can rise up and down as floods happen. That's a high-tech solution, which at least in a few places may work. But if you're in Tuvalu or any of the low-lying atoll states that are inundated, then the question simply becomes, yes, you're a climate migrant. Yes, somebody is going to have to take those people in, or they are going to drown. And we need to stop and think very carefully about how to do that, and think about it in advance would be really helpful, so that we don't have sort of crisis emergency scrambles to deal with entirely predictable future events. And it's the lack of thinking intelligently about the future that is probably what causes me more despair than anything else. The more complicated issue with climate migrants is that there's a huge migration to the cities of the world, particularly across the global south. Most of the modern states in Europe and North America have already done it. where the vast majority of people live in urban areas and the agricultural and rural population is relatively very small. That is still happening across many parts of the world, and indeed the extraordinary migrations in China in the last couple of decades of hundreds of millions of people moving is unprecedented. But it's a pattern that we are now living with. Most of the migrants happen within existing state boundaries. Many of them are pushed because of crop failures and so on that may or may not be related directly to climate, which makes it very difficult to tease out who's a climate refugee in these circumstances from who's just somebody that's moving to the cities anyway, because that's where the jobs are. And clearly we are dealing with a massive movement of people. Part of it is climate, very obviously, when places are flooded out, it's climate. But there's all those other migration phenomena happening simultaneously. Most of them happen within state boundaries, but there are clearly going to be places where this isn't going to be possible, both because of unlivable heat, climate disruptions from heat events, as well as flooding and so on. Thinking about us as a mobile species rather than one that is stuck within those boundaries is something else we need to stop and think about. The danger, of course, is that this gets very alarmist and people see massive migration as a threat to political stability. Go back to 2015 and the images of people walking across the Balkans heading from the Middle East. It epitomized fear of migrant hordes, of danger, of all sorts of things. The Germans at least had the good sense to open the borders first, so they got all the talented doctors and accountants and engineers that were trying to escape the Middle East into their labor pool, because those are the people that go first. The point about this is that if those people are then turned into a threat, and security, fences, borders, machine guns are seen as the appropriate response, then we're simply compounding the humanitarian crisis that has set them in motion in the first place. And this is clearly something that Europe is facing, and the United States is facing it a bit on the southern border too, and simply treating desperate people, many of whom are talented, would be useful additions to the labor force of where they're trying to get to, which is why they're trying to get there, as a security threat that needs to be dealt with violence and exclusion, simply makes everything worse. But what most states have yet to do is think through intelligent immigration. We just don't do that well. That said, final point, I looked at the figures 2 or 3 years ago, of the more alarming suggestions about climate migration in Africa, in terms of the 50, 100 million and in motion by the middle of the century. And I then looked at the projections for the urbanization figures of Nigeria alone, one of 56 or 57 African countries. I always forget how many there are these days. And in terms of the sheer number of people moving to cities, that was about the number that was anticipated for Nigeria alone, regardless of climate. So we need to be careful about the scale of the migration, where it's going, and how we tackle it. But clearly thinking through carefully about how to facilitate movement.
Thank you, Simon. I'm not sure if you're aware, we have a significant migration, south-south migration hub at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and I see some of our colleagues are with us today. I also wanted to ask you more questions about governance and the causes and the need for explicitly stating the causes of the current crisis. But I see we have a question in the chat, one from Gwyneth. It seems that this is about space tourism and then beyond the planetary boundaries, perhaps. So it seems that the rise in space tourism will have a severe environmental impact, and with some of that impact occurring very much outside of our political borders. Do you feel that policymakers are adequately acknowledging the potential implications, or does the current infrequency of these flights make them less of a concern for the Anthropocene?
So far, there's, Captain Kirk went to space finally, was it last week or the week before? Came back in tears, which was a very interesting media event. Shatner and a few of his friends are getting into space, and yes, that's wasting a heck of a lot of jet fuel. And in terms of the sheer individual carbon footprint, space tourism is about as disastrous as it gets. And clearly, the planet needs a whole lot more useful things for rocket technology than simply sending movie stars and very rich people up for a few minutes. Surely we can do better as a species than that. With all due respect to Star Trek fans, we actually know we live in a fragile, thin biosphere. We don't need Shatner getting up there and looking at it to tell us this. And I think that the priorities in terms of what the rich and powerful are able to do are such a disconnect from what the rest of humanity needs, that the basic climate justice questions are highlighted by such antics. In terms of the sheer number of space flights, it's small in terms of the greenhouse, overall greenhouse effect. In terms of the individual contribution, it's huge. And we need to think about it in those terms. Clearly, there are much better things to spend billions of dollars on than building spacecraft for, well, billionaires to go and play. And I think that this highlights the gross injustices that globalization has highlighted. And I didn't talk much about the huge ecological consequences of the massive inequities in our economy. But clearly that's simply unavoidable. And the climate justice folks that are talking in Glasgow next month are going to be emphasizing this point. But insofar as the rich and powerful think that their status acquired by their ability to blast off into space is something highly desirable for all the rest of us, then we have a major sort of identity problem in terms of who we are as human beings and how we should live. Because clearly we're living in an artificial world in which that kind of celebration of affluence is done at the expense of everybody else. And we need to be absolutely clear about that as part of the politics of the Anthropocene.
Perhaps just to follow on from that point, then, I just wondered whether you had any further comments on the work of authors such as, is it Jason Hickel and his discussion on the idea of degrowth, and I think his framing of the Anthropocene as the Capitalocene, and it is actually the question of economic justice and the gross inequalities, which is really fundamental to the crisis we're facing now.
Two comments on that. First, on the notion of degrowth. I think degrowth is great insofar as it highlights the assumption of growth as sort of the ideology of our times. The assumption is that is the prerequisite for all other social activity. And Hickel and company are great on pointing out that we've got to challenge that head on. We've got to figure out how to organize economics in ways that actually deals with what people need, hence my invocation of Kate Raworth's donut economics, because that very conveniently links it up with the whole planetary boundaries framework. But that said, we need to grow bicycle paths and good health systems or non-growth. It's a matter of growing what, and we are in danger sometimes of losing that crucial point in the discussions of degrowth. And I think we need to be careful how it is we specify that. Growth, just as a straight economic measurement, is not helpful. But growing public health systems, growing vaccine manufacturing is crucial. Ungrowing, if you'll forgive the term, space tourism would probably help if that money could be diverted into vaccine production instead. And I think we need to be very clear about that. As to the Capitalocene or the capital scene, or however you wish to pronounce that, clearly the extraordinary acceleration of human activity does really date from the rise of capitalism, European imperial expansion and colonization, which is why Donna Haraway talks about the Plantationocene. And indeed, the Plantationocene, I have no idea how to pronounce these terms, is clearly is useful in so far as it reminds us of the dramatic ecosystem changes as the expansion of agriculture has dramatically changed how landscapes function. And that was one of the points I made in my talk. I tend to hang on to the Anthropocene because I usually note it's a geological term. And so what is actually the crucial mechanism that puts us in a new geological period? And of course, I'm a fan of Stephen Pine's fire history, because Stephen Pine's argument is that, look, beavers are great hydrological engineers. Whales and elephants have got sophisticated cultural communication systems. Ants build extraordinary architectural phenomena. language, wolves communicate with tails and semaphore signals to, or something like that. So culture doesn't, the one thing we do as a humanity is fire. We have partially learned to control the ignition trick. And that's the geophysical mechanism that has changed everything, is that a species for the first time in the history of the planet has partially controlled a crucial geophysical process, fire. And it's our partial control of combustion that means we, as humanity, have generated an entirely new phenomena in the planetary history. Yes, it's been dramatically scaled up, and the disruptions that are being caused to the planetary system are as a result of the rise of capitalism and subsequently its appropriation of the ecological resources in fossil fuels. But you need both bits of that picture. You need the fact that humanity actually has taken partial control of a key geophysical process in the planetary history, hence the Anthropocene as a geological formation works. Even if it doesn't, the term itself doesn't actually specify the extraordinary qualitative change in that process that has come about really since the Industrial Revolution, which was in turn a social consequence of capitalism. And we need to draw the links between those carefully. And the problem that we have, of course, is that one word doesn't really capture all of this, which is why you need Plantationocene, Capitalocene, and Anthropocene to really draw those links together. I stick to Anthropocene because it's the geological term that was first used, and it does allow me to make that link with a species taking control of a geophysical process, which is at the heart of this whole thing.
Thank you so much, Simon. We're coming roughly to the end, but if we have time for just one final question. As you know, the UK is hosting the COP, the climate change talks, in November this year, and the expectations are huge. Professor Gordon Crawford has written in the chat, so transformative changes are clearly needed. What are the key ones, in your view, to protect people and planet, and how can they be achieved? With 2 question marks, acknowledging that the question is a difficult one.
Only 2 question marks after that one. Look, this is the big question. I hinted at it in my talk briefly in terms of investments. The key to so much of this is where the money goes. I mean, follow the money is an old cliche, but boy, does it fit in this case. The decisions that big investment houses, that governments make in terms of what kind of infrastructure to invest in. If you're buying solar panels and windmills, it's very different from if you're buying oil wells. If you're putting money into rapidly expanding batteries and other forms of electrical storage, you get a different planet down the road than if you are putting money into coal mines. And it really is a crucial question of convincing financial managers, investment house managers, and governments that are directing the money that is supposed to reconstruct our economies after the pandemic disruptions. If those are going into fossil fuels, then it's just making everything worse. If they're being redirected into retrofits for houses to keep people warm so they don't have to burn so much stuff, those are major investment decisions that need to be made. And that's part of the problem with COP, is it's still talking about emissions. It's still treating climate change as a pollution problem. It's an investment problem and a production problem. And how you get people to shift that focus away from, putting things on the end of tailpipes to prevent pollution to actually not having tailpipes at all. That's the major shift that needs to be undertaken. And for economists and political scientists, never mind the occasional geographer, how to move that conversation ahead is crucial. And of course, the Anthropocene gives us the intellectual framework which allows us to focus on the fact that it's an increasingly artificial world, hence we're shaping the future trajectory of that. It gives us the intellectual framework which allows us to make those arguments. And Anthropocene has the advantage of allowing us the intellectual room to make that argument, which we all need to do as loud and long and effectively as we can in coming years.
Thank you so much, Simon. And you've written explicitly in your articles and your publications of the need to be very clear on what the causes and the root problems are, and if we're able to even think about tackling them effectively. And the idea of looking at production, of investment, and explicitly mentioning fossil fuels, which so far, and you stated even in Paris, it wasn't really clearly explicitly stated that this is the problem and this is what needs to happen. And if we're not at that stage, then how can we truly successfully respond to the problem if we're not willing to clearly state what it is? And the fossil fuels, extractivism, and agriculture, I think you mentioned as the kind of three key areas that we really have to target. We'd like to say a really huge thank you, Simon, for engaging with us and presenting your research today. It's hugely rewarding and inspiring to be able to listen to you, and we would love to continue to read your publications, your blogs, particularly around the time of the COP. We hope there will be a vibrant and very loud debate in the UK, and we hope that we can learn from your research and share it. So thank you, Simon.